the webinar on de-risking regulatory filings through pre-submission consultations. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Brandwood BIOMEDICAL, a regulatory consulting firm based in Sydney, Australia and Beijing, China. And before I begin, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping on how we run these webinars. So you should be looking at a screen that looks a bit like this at the moment. You'll see that there's the slides in your webinar viewer, and then you should have a separate little box with an orange arrow on it right there. When you click that, you can open the control panel, and I draw your attention particularly to this questions box where it says here, enter a question for staff. As I go through the webinar today, feel free to ask questions by simply typing the question into the box. I won't take them as we go through, but what we will do is collect the questions up, and then when we're finished, we'll then go into a question and answer session where I'll deal with the questions that are asked. So, firstly, just explaining who I am and where we come from. BIOMEDICAL, we are a medical devices and in vitro diagnostics regulatory advisory and technical advisory firm. We have a particular focus in the Asia Pacific. We're headquartered here in Sydney, Australia. We have offices also in Wellington, New Zealand, and in Beijing, China, and a network of close partners, accredited partners, which work with us across Southeast Asia and East Asia. We have a global perspective on regulation. That's important. Regulations are constantly changing. There are efforts to harmonize, and understanding what each different regulator is doing brings you a more rounded view and allows you to understand how any individual regulator behaves. We say we're highly networked and highly engaged, and I point that out as a bit of an introduction to today's webinar. It's important that you spend time getting to know regulators, getting to know others in the industry so that you develop a relationship. We say that everything's about relationships in Asia. Well, everything's about relationships everywhere, really. It's important that you can build relationships with regulatory agencies and with others in the industry so that you can have conversations from a position of familiarity and credibility. And to do that, you've got to be engaged. We spend time working with things like the Asian Harmonization Working Party and with industry associations so that we can then work with the regulatory agencies and with our colleagues. That's the approach we bring, and it really is a lead-in to the subject of today's talk, which is about working with regulators and entering into an engaged discussion with a regulator prior to the formal process of a regulatory filing. Now, you know, Australian speakers like to put pictures of cute Australian animals in their presentations. I don't like to do that. I like to put pictures of strange and weird Australian animals, and this one is an Australian echidna, and it's a metaphor for a regulator. You'll notice that it's got lots of spines on its back, but it's also got a long tongue, a long nose and a long tongue, which you can put into nooks and crannies and seek out all sorts of information. It's got strong claws to dig through anything. It's very good at finding things. And if you upset it, it rolls itself up into a ball and puts a bunch of spines in your face. Well, regulators aren't really that bad, but you do need to know how to deal with them. And being combative and upsetting and insisting that your position is right is never a good way to start. So what's the agenda today? What I'm going to talk about is how and why to do a pre-submission filing with a regulator. Why would you do this? What are the objectives for a pre-submission filing, and how do you go about it? So we're going to deal with all three of those things. But let's start with thinking about, you know, what might be a typical regulatory submission process. Firstly, you develop your product and compile the technical file, all of the test data and clinical information that you expect to be able to have to supply to the regulator for the purposes of a marketing submission. In the process of doing that, you might consult standards and regulatory guidances. that'll tell you a lot about what specifically the regulators are going to expect in terms of the test data that you bring to the table for them to review and provide a product license. You pull it all together and you finally submit your technical dossier addressing the standards and guidances and describing your product and the testing data you've got. You wait nervously for the questions to come back from the reviewers. And then those questions come back and you realize, oh dear, the regulator doesn't really understand poor you. This usually leads to panic. And then you struggle to deliver responses to satisfy reviewer requests. Does this sound familiar? I've certainly seen this process work this way. It shouldn't work this way. Think about it from the other side. Oh, sorry, yes. The other thing about this, before I move on to looking at the reviewer, this is an expensive and damaging debacle if you end up like this. You often end up spending lots of money right at the end of the process in hurried last-minute work to try to satisfy the regulatory review. The regulator's life looks like this. They spend their time dealing with lots of submissions, and believe me, they're not page turners. I don't know what you write with your regulatory submissions, but I'll bet you it's not an airport thriller. Okay, so the regulator is sitting there with lots of submissions, plowing through data every day. It's hardly an exciting existence. It doesn't have to be like this. You can change things so that you can use a pre-submission process to engage with the regulator before you go through the regulatory submission, where you can reach a level of understanding, a level of engagement, and a level of credibility for yourself by having had a conversation with the regulator and had the opportunity to explain your technology and to understand their perspective and what it is that they find is important about the review that they're going to do. So what sort of things might you deal with in a pre-submission? What are the talking points? What are the discussion points that you might want to tackle in a pre-submission review? Well, you might have new technology. Everybody thinks their technology is new, but you may genuinely have something that's new and different, and the pre-submission provides a valuable opportunity simply to sit down with the reviewer and explain what it is you're about to bring to them. What is that's different about your technology? How does it work? What does it look like? You may have a specific question to do with the process. For example, you can't find a predicate. Do I really need to go down the road of a de novo 510K? Or are there other ways to establish a predicate device for my technology? You may want to seek feedback on the approach that you want to take to testing, including finding out what are the regulators' expectations for preclinical studies. There's things written in guidances, there's things written in standards, but in these days of risk assessment, it's increasingly difficult to understand precisely what will be expected by the regulator, when they will want to see testing, and when you'll be able to justify through risk management that you don't need to do testing. What about use of international clinical data? There are, of course, international treaties that allow for the recognition of clinical studies done in one country by signatories to the OECD Treaty on clinical trials, but there are a number of caveats around that. Most regulators will say, yes, we in theory will accept international data, but we want to know that the standards of good clinical practice were the same in the country where the study was done as in our country, and we also want to know that those data are going to be relevant to the patient populations and demographics of the country where you're seeking a marketing approval. So what about use of international clinical data? A pre-submission consultation is exactly the right place to be able to sit with the regulator, propose where you're going to do your studies, which sites you're going to use, how many sites, the nature of those studies, and confirm the acceptability of those data or whether you're going to need to modify your approach. So use of international, and as the FDA calls it, OUS, outside US clinical data, is a very valid subject for a pre-submission consultation. What about deficiencies in your data? Nothing's ever perfect. You may have, for example, a high number of deviations from protocols in clinical studies. You may have a test method which had to be varied because of the nature of your technology. Pre-submission allows you to present this to the regulator and discuss how to deal with that, whether the deficiencies can be managed and what ways they can be managed. What about if you've taken unorthodox or non-standard approaches to testing, or you've departed from a guidance? You may have a view that the guidance is not appropriate for your product. Rather than having that debate in the confines of a formal review, it's much better to have a conversation up front where you can approach the regulator, explain why the technology requires a different approach. It may be simply the technology is different, or it may be that the approach in the guidance is just unnecessarily burdensome, and you can find a more efficient way of doing things. Talk it through, present that case in the pre-submission. You may seek specific feedback on proposed clinical study designs and protocols. Pre-submission processes certainly allow for detailed review of protocols and specific feedback from the regulators. And in fact, this is one area where regulators particularly encourage pre-submission filings and discussions. The clinical stage, of course, is usually the most expensive part of the product development pathway, and it's really worthwhile talking that through before you embark on the clinical studies, because what the last thing you want to find out in your when you finally make your marketing submission is that the clinical study was inadequate and you've either got to extend or repeat clinical trials. And finally, a specific one, if in the area of in vitro diagnostics, what is the regulator's expectation on approaches to diagnostic evaluation, and how can you balance the use of laboratory analytical studies showing performance of the diagnostic versus actual clinical trials, and should they be prospective or should they be retrospective, should they use reserved samples? All of that can be worked out in a pre-submission discussion. So these are just some examples, but what you're really trying to find is what's the key risks of interest to the regulator, to FDA or to whoever it is you're talking to. What are the key things that matter for the regulator with your technology that review is going to want to be satisfied about before they'll sign off on a marketing approval. That's what you're really looking to do. Now, in the United States, there's an extensive guidance document on how to go about this. Recently, the FDA updated in 2014. They updated the pre-submission process. It used to be called pre-ID. Pre-IDE was pre-investigational device exemption. It was a program that was developed back in the 1990s where it was intended specifically for applicants to talk to the regulatory agency before they did a clinical study. It grew and grew, and the number of pre-IDE submissions that were going to the agency grew, and the purpose of those submissions crept in scope until that program was being used for all sorts of questions. And so last year in 2014, the FDA completely changed the process and introduced the pre-submission program, which has a broader scope and is not just about clinical studies, but allows for a range of other submissions prior to filing either a clinical trial submission or to filing a marketing submission through a 510K or a PMA. Here's the content of a pre-submission filing to the FDA. This is what they expect to see. So starts with a cover letter including the reason for the request. Simply a succinct administrative letter saying who you are, here's the administrative information, this is the device, and setting out very clearly and concisely why you are seeking a pre-submission consultation. A table of contents just like any submission, it's important to be organized, obvious stuff like using tabs and dividers and preparing this. The FDA does accept electronic submissions, so you can use all of the approaches there for filing a submission on electronic media with one hard copy. You need to put in a thorough device description. If you're going to have a discussion with the agency about your new technology or a new device that you're bringing forward, there needs to be a good description, and it needs to be sufficiently detailed in the areas that matter that you want to discuss. So detail for the agency to understand the aspects of technology that we discussed. Do include pictures, do include drawings. Even video is helpful. One of the things that the FDA suggests in their guidance is that, for example, if you have a surgical device which is used in a new procedure, send them a video of the procedure as part of the pre-submission filing so they can really understand what it is you're dealing with. The submission must include a proposed intended use and indications. This is really important. All of the discussion you're going to be having is going to be within the context of your stated intended use. So if you subsequently change that in a substantive way, then you may invalidate the entire exercise. Changing it later, you risk invalidating the consensus from your discussion. Of course, one of the things you can actually be discussing is what is the permissible intended use for technology, what is the scope, what are the constraints that the agency may want to see around an intended use. The submission should include an overview of product development. You need to set out the testing and clinical studies you've done or that you're planning to do. It is important to understand, though, that a pre-submission filing is for feedback and consultation. It is not about a substantive review. So don't expect the FDA to be reviewing the adequacy of your data. They will not do that. They will specifically refuse to do that. This is not about understanding whether you've got adequate data. It's about understanding whether the approach you're suggesting, the testing that you're proposing to do or have done, is going to satisfy the regulator. And then finally, what are your specific questions? And we'll come on to that in more detail in a moment, but really this is the art of the whole piece. You need to have quite focused, closed questions. What you're doing with the questions is essentially seeking concurrence to your preferred approach or viewpoint. So how does that work? Keep the questions specific and closed. You've set out what your device is, how you've developed, what is the nature of the technology, and why it is you're coming to the FDA for a pre-submission. So now is the time to ask the questions which address your objective. So you need to know, what is your objective? What is it you're wanting to get out of the pre-submission? You're going to need to present your case in the submission in writing, and then design your questions to seek the regulator agreement to that objective. So let's just think about how you might ask some questions. You might say, for example, that you believe, for whatever your stated reasons are, that the device has a particular classification, and you explicitly say, can the FDA confirm your interpretation is correct? What you don't want to say, please, Mr. FDA, advise me the classification. The nature of regulators is they are conservative, that's their job. And if you give them an open-ended question like that, then you're going to get the most conservative answer, and you may not get the answer you want. So you need to be able to make the agenda here, set out what it is you want to do, and ask whether the regulator agrees with your point of view. You may say, we intend using a particular device as a predicate. Now, that device may not be a particularly good fit, but there are technological differences, but believe you can address those in a way you're going to describe in the submission. Again, closed question, does the FDA accept this approach and accept that that's a sensible predicate to use? Don't say, we can't find a predicate, what should we do? It's not up to the FDA to consult and advise you how to do that. You have to come with them with a prepared position and seek their feedback on that. You may say, here's my proposed study design for a clinical trial with a justification as to why it's to be done this way. Do you agree with this approach? You're not going to say, what's the FDA's prepared design for these types of devices? And apologies for the typo there. So don't just go and ask for what the general preferred approach is. That's usually in guidance anyway. Come forward with your preferred approach for your clinical study and see the FDA's specific feedback on that. So what's some of the best practices for actually doing a pre-submission? Well, firstly, just be courteous and flexible with the dates and arrangements. You may be busy and have a busy schedule, but the regulators have got a pile of stuff on their plate as well. They're usually pretty accommodating in trying to meet everybody's needs, but you're going to need to be flexible so that you can schedule the meeting at a time that suits everybody and make the arrangements that suit anybody. Be very clear about what your objectives are. Present the right information. Be focused with those questions. Understand before you start off, before you even consider preparing a pre-submission, what it is you want to get out of it, and design your submission to get to that point. And have the right experts at the table. They need to be authoritative and knowledgeable, but for goodness sake, keep them focused. One of the challenges of having the technical experts at the table, of course, is they love to talk at length about their chosen subject. There needs to be good preparation. There needs to be focus on the objectives and keeping the discussion to just the things you want to resolve. And do remember, the regulator is not a consultant. They're not going to provide you open-ended advice. They're not going to answer open-ended questions, and they will not make binding promises. Pre-consultations are about what are the normal expectations, getting feedback from the regulator, suggestions, but they are not a means of getting a binding commitment on a way forward. So let's just look at this in actual process terms, and here's the FDA example. I will come on to some others later. I'm using the FDA as a model for all of this, but here's the pre-submission process with the United States FDA. So it starts with you preparing your submission and filing it with the regulator. They will do an acceptance review where they look at what you've sent and determine whether what you actually have is a valid pre-submission, that it's worthwhile going forwards. They will conduct their own technical review, they will read the submission and assess it, and then they'll give you some preliminary feedback. And then there'll be a meeting, and then there'll be a closeout. Now, just some more specific points on some of these stages. Firstly, the preliminary feedback may be interactive. It's quite common in FDA pre-submissions to get an email. In fact, it's normal that you'll get an email response saying, we need to clarify this point and this point, or these are our preliminary thoughts on some of the questions. In some cases, it may stop there. The FDA may say, well, what you've sent us is pretty straightforward in our view. Here's our feedback. We don't think we need to proceed to a meeting. Or it may be, here's our initial feedback, here are the things we need clarifying. You'll have a round of emails, you may even have a couple of telephone calls, and then you'll go into a meeting. The meeting can be face-to-face. You can travel to Washington and meet with the FDA, or it can be by electronic means, a teleconference, a video conference, or a web meeting. Do be prepared to make sure that the web software works, of course, and for everybody. And be prepared to be flexible with the dates around that meeting and the arrangements. And finally, the closeout minutes, that's actually your job. So it's up to you to keep a record of the meeting, to write the minutes, send them to FDA, and they will review them and either accept them or they will amend them if they disagree or they want to add additional comments. And providing you're agreeable to their amendments, then you can close out, and that becomes the formal record of the consultation. Just thinking about timescales for here, the acceptance review is usually done within 14 days. The FDA try to get back to you within 21 days of your filing to schedule the meeting. The meeting isn't within 21 days, but they will within 21 days be back in touch with you to see about sorting out the time and the logistics of the meeting. Prior to the meeting, you will get preliminary feedback, and that's always at least 3 days prior to the meeting to give you a chance to contemplate that feedback and maybe make any clarifications. The meeting itself is intended to be within 75 days of the filing. Frequently, it's quite a lot earlier than that, and the FDA sets itself a target of closing out all pre-submissions within 90 days. let's just look at which other agencies do that. The Japanese PMDA is probably the best other example. They offer an extensive consultation list of options, and here they say you can do pre-consultations at each phase, from pre-development, quality, consultations around testing, safety consultations around the verification, looking at performance testing, looking specifically at clinical evaluation requirements, and the Japanese PMDA encourage all applicants to make pre-submission consultations wherever a large clinical trial is involved. When you're doing your exploratory pilot trials, what are the appropriate designs, and then when you come to do your pivotal, have a consultation and understand what the agency's expectations are. And then finally, when you've gathered all of that, do a pre-application consultation to check what the procedures should be, confirm that you've got everything in place. In Japan, the meetings are pre-booked. The same way as FDA, the process is very similar to that in the US. The documents are submitted for review prior to the meeting. The PMDA comes back with a written opinion and questions. You then provide a written response. So there's actually a round of questions and review. And then finally the face-to-face meeting happens. It's actually recorded. Draft minutes are circulated for comment. Those final minutes are then shared, and it's all done. And there are meeting fees for each of these types of meetings. It's quite an expensive process in Japan, but it can deliver a lot of value in saved time and clarity about what the agency's expectations will be. And other agencies do like to talk as well. The US and the Japanese ones have the most formal and well-defined pre-submission process, but you can talk to others. European notified bodies, for example, will engage in a pre-contract discussion or review of what it is you're trying to do. So it's perfectly possible to have an informal discussion with a notified body about what your device is, what your approach to conformity assessment is going to be, and what their expectations will be. They will not step over a line of consulting, and certainly in Europe, the European Commission has been increasingly strict about notified bodies not engaging in consulting activities, so they're quite sensitive about that. But you can have sensible and meaningful conversations informally arranged when you first approach a notified body, where you can say, look, we want to talk to you about what our technology is. We'd like to have a discussion prior to signing a contract for a CE conformity assessment review. Other agencies have got informal arrangements as well. Certainly here in Australia, the Australian TGA encourages pre-submission consultations, having a meeting with the agency prior to filing a complex conformity assessment submission. They don't like to do it if you're simply using the fast-track procedures in Australia where you rely on overseas certification. That's not case that you do a pre-submission filing there, but that's a much abbreviated process. But when you're doing a direct TGA conformity assessment, they encourage you to arrange to either talk to them by telephone or have a correspondence about the technology, or go and meet with the agency. So that's pre-submission. It's really a process where it allows you to introduce yourself to the agency, to introduce your technology, to explain what your approach is to demonstrating compliance with regulations, explain your approach to the verification testing, safety testing, performance testing of your product, explain your approach to your clinical studies and clinical evaluation, and have a conversation about that. That conversation leads to several things. It leads to the agency getting to know you. It allows you to demonstrate that you actually do understand your technology, that you have thought through what you're doing, and you're taking the trouble to go and talk to the agency and seek their feedback. That buys a lot of credibility. So you will be talking to the people who are going to do the final review in most cases, which means that when you actually file your 510K or file your application for conformity assessment, the people who are doing the review have already met you, have already understood where you're coming from, have already have some understanding of your technology. It's going to make things flow quite a lot smoother, and it's going to make that conversation move to quite a different level where it's moving, where it's a conversation that's happening based on familiarity and some mutual respect that's been developed in the pre-submission. So at that point, I think I'll conclude. I'll bring you another cute Australian animal and take questions. I just need to find the questions here. So here we are. I now have the list of questions. Sorry, I was just having a bit of problem getting them up on the screen. Now, the first question I have is from Mike, which says, can you choose the specific regulator to have the pre-meeting with? Assuming that you choose that regulator due to familiarity with the device and the intended use, does that regulator follow through the continuum of the approval? I'm assuming from that question, when you say specific regulator, you're talking about the specific reviewer. Certainly with the United States FDA, the process works in that you file the pre-submission and it goes to the branch that will be dealing with your submission when you finally do file the submission. In most cases, you're going to be speaking to the review team that will be dealing with you in the actual submission, but you don't get a choice in that. The FDA is a large agency. It's got something like 1,500 people, but within each individual division, they're smaller groups. So it's a pretty good expectation that the people you'll be talking with will be the technical experts who will be dealing with your device. So no, you don't get to choose, but usually it's going to be people who are going to be working with you. Now, Tara Carruthers, Tara asks about, should you have an interpreter for Japanese discussions? Absolutely. The Japanese PMDA does deal in the Japanese language, so yes, you will need to take interpreters with you. No question about that. I have a question from Chen Yuan, which says, does China, the CFDA, have pre-submission meetings? To my knowledge, there's no formal process for pre-submission in China. But there are two ways of doing this. Firstly, there is what is called the Open Window Thursday. Literally, at the Chinese FDA, it is possible to attend the agency once a week and join a line and take your questions to the agency and do it in an ad hoc manner. So there are possibilities for taking questions to the agency every week, but there's no formal process, there's no pre-review, it's simply turn up and ask the question. Separately, it is possible to approach the agency to seek meetings on substantive issues. However, it's not a common thing that's done, and it usually is in the case where there is a real need for consultation because the technology is new or the regulations are not very clear in relation to the particular device. And you've got to have a good solid reason for having a meeting and doing so. But it is informally managed, and you do need to work through somebody who's familiar with the agency. You can find the right person to talk to. Mike asks a follow-up question, says, is this primarily for 510K and not PMA? Not at all. The pre-submission process is designed for any case where there will be a subsequent marketing application to the agency. So you can do a pre-submission prior to doing an IDE submission. You can do a pre-submission prior to a low-risk IDE where you will not be making an IDE submission to the agency. You'll just be going to the ethics committee, but you may want to understand what will be the agency's subsequent expectations for that study. You can go and do a pre-sub. You can do a pre-sub prior to a 510K filing, or you can do a pre-sub prior to a PMA filing. All of these are possible. Jessipina asks, in Australia, how do you propose a pre-submission meeting? Simply contact the agency. You're going to need to talk to the TGA, call them up and say, we're about to file a conformity assessment, direct conformity assessment submission, we would like to have some discussion with you about the approach to that and what the content should be, and arrange a meeting. There's not a formal process, there's no written guidance on that, but you can approach the agency and request a meeting. Mai has asked, is China FDA's Open Window Thursday also available for overseas manufacturers if we take an interpreter with us? Absolutely it is. They will take all comers, and you can take somebody with you and go and do that. And finally, I think we have Maya's just asked a follow-up question. Do you need to reserve the Open Thursday? No, you just turn up, although one of the problems is there's a lot of people turn up. You need to get there early. In fact, you can need to get there very early to get in the queue and take your number. So it's not an ideal process, but it does provide rapid turnaround for some straightforward questions. Okay, another question, what other agencies? Mike has asked if the Korean FDA will do pre-submission meetings. Again, the Korean agency is not one of those that has a formal process in this case, but it's certainly entirely possible to reach out to the agency and request a meeting on a regulatory submission. That again requires a bit of knowledge as to who you're dealing with, which part of the agency you need to talk to, but it's certainly the case that they will gladly arrange a meeting to review specific issues prior to a submission, and they'll also do so sometimes during the course of the submission. And other agencies you can do this. Agencies we've been involved with for pre-submission discussions include, for example, the Taiwan FDA, as well as Korea, Japan PMDA, the US, Australia, and European notified bodies. Jessipina asked the question, will TGA do a pre-assessment for literature-based, I'll just remove that, sorry, will TGA do a pre-assessment for literature-based submissions where the product is manufactured in Europe? I want to clarify, if you've got a product manufactured in Europe and you're taking it to TGA, this is for medical devices we're talking about, so I'm assuming your question relates to medical devices. When you're taking it to TGA, you may be presenting a CE certificate and getting a Australian registration on the basis of that. TGA will not normally engage in pre-submission discussions for that regulatory pathway. They will engage in pre-submission discussions and encourage them when you are approaching TGA for the direct conformity assessment certification to be granted by TGA. And that's only required for high-risk medical devices, specifically class 3 devices containing a medicine or a biological substance. If you've got one of those and you're going to TGA for a conformity assessment, it's possible, in fact wise, to have a discussion with the agency before you file. Okay, well, I think that's the end of all of our questions, and I trust you've found this informative and useful. Please feel free to send us subsequent questions by email. There's the address on the screen. Email us at any time at help@brandwoodbiomedical.com. If you're looking to do a pre-submission, we can certainly assist you with doing that, and we have direct experience of doing that with a number of regulatory agencies. Thank you for your joining us today, and do keep your eye on the newsletter and look forward to future webinars with Brandwood Biomedical. Good day.